So React allows us to build component-based UI, which means instead of building our components as one unit, we break it down into multiple components. And each component can be developed separately, tested, and then our UI at the end of the day becomes a composition of components. That's what React allows us to do. So in terms of skills, these are the three major skills you need to learn. You need to know how to create a React component. You need to know how to make them communicate with each other. And finally, you need to know how to do routing. Routing means typically you might have some kind of menu, and when the user clicks the link, you load the appropriate component. And that we will be discussing as well. So as we saw last time, React is one of the major client-side components-based frameworks or libraries to build user interfaces. It happens to be competing heavily with Angular and Vue, but it is quite popular these days, used by many websites, such as the ones you see here, Facebook, Instagram, Dropbox, and so on. And it fits in the front-end development. So instead of just using the plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, of course you will be using this, but you push them to a more professional level to be able to build a large or medium-sized applications. And this also fits within the single-page application. So React, as I will show you shortly, allows us to build this single-page application that has one single page, and then as the user interacts with the page, components get loaded into the page. Now, when we create a React component, first of all, we need to keep in mind that a component returns some HTML elements using JSX, and also inside the component, we might have some state and some event handlers. And we have seen last time this, but I will explain it further. So when I create a React component, how do I create a React component? By simply creating a function. So I create the function, and the name of the function will become the name of my component. This function can optionally receive some inputs from the user of this component. And typically this input, React people, they call it props. And inside, when I do whatever I need to do inside the component, I finally return some JSX. This is what JSX looks like. It looks like HTML, and with some static text plus access to some variables. In this case, what I'm accessing, the app name attribute of the props parameter. So once I create a component using a function, I use it exactly the same way I use any other HTML element by putting it as a tag. It looks like a tag here. So this is the welcome tag, and this I am passing this parameter to this component. And this parameter app name will be available in this parameter props, and this is how I access it. So we have seen this. This is just a quick reminder. So at the end of the day, although it looks like returning some kind of HTML, which is called JSX, in reality, when the app runs, or before the app runs, you need to convert from this JSX to plain JavaScript. At the end of the day, the JSX gets converted to JavaScript object. And there is a tool called Babel that allows us to do this. And I will explain this shortly through an example. Okay, so moving on, let me show you concretely how typically we construct or we organize our project, how typically the project is organized. So as you see here, in most React developers, when they create a project, they put all the scripts and the HTML and the component they create under a subfolder called SRC, which is basically the source that they have developed. This is a convention. You can do it the way you wish, but this is the convention. So under the source, you typically, just to keep things organized, all your component that you create will be under another subfolder called components. And the root of the source, what you find the HTML page. How many HTML pages we will have in our app? One. Because this app follows which architecture? Single page architecture. And this page will be scary and complex. As you can see here, only has few lines, it has nothing, this page. What does it have? Take a look at this. What this page has? All it has, first of all, have this div. You can call it whatever, but usually people call it root. And script pointing to the entry point of my app. You know, in a normal programming like C++ or Java, we always have some kind of main function that acts as the entry point. When I run my program, if the program has thousands of functions, the operating system will be confused which function to start from. So how do we remove this confusion and let the operating system know which function to start from? We have one function called main. So in here, it's kind of similar. In here, what we do is we tell in this page, here is the entry point of our program, of our app, and the entry point will be in this index.js. So that's it. This is the typical page in React. This is the only index page we have, and this is the content of it. That's all we have. Okay. Now, let's see what is in this index.js. Let's see what's in this index.js. Again, in this index.js, what do we have? So all we are doing, I am creating an instance of this component called app. I'm rendering it, which means I'm creating an instance of it. And what I'm doing with this instance that I created, injecting it into the main page. That's what this index is doing. All it's doing, creating an instance of the app, which is the kind of the root component of my application, and injecting it in the page. Now the next question will be, what is in this app? Okay. This app is basically a component. You remember a component, how do I create a component? It is a function at the end of the day. And this function returns some JSX. So in here, so what I have here, basically what I have a bunch of components that I put inside a div. I have a welcome component, I have two avatar components, I have a counter, and so on. So what I have here, I have a bunch of components that I can develop separately. That's basically the idea of React. Each piece of the UI is a separate component that I can develop, test, and be comfortable with, and then my user interface will be a composition of these components. So it's exactly what's going on here. So let me summarize quickly. This is the typical architecture of how we organize our app. I create a project, and inside this project, I create a folder called source, SRC, and inside it, I have this index.html, and this index.html only has two things. A div where I will mount or where I will inject my main component, and a reference to the index.js. Yeah? Okay. And in this index.js, all I am doing, I'm creating the main component of my app and injecting it into the page. And the main component of my app, this is where I put my components. This is a little bit more complicated than needed because I am just putting a bunch of components that are not really related. These are just examples that I'm working on. But in real life, in this app, you might just have a nav bar, maybe a footer, and the main component that you see, where the home component. But the idea is that the app, this is where you put your components. And each of these components you will develop separately and test separately. Okay, now, before you run this program, you basically need to transpile. Remember this? Remember these components here? They are returning JSX. What did we say that JSX at the end of the day it is? It needs to be transpiled to some JavaScript object. So there are many tools to do so. One of them happens to be called Parcel Bundler. Parcel Bundler. A very super simple utility that allows us to basically transpile the components files and bundle them in one file or a couple of files. There is another one. This is quite new and it's not as popular as but very simple. That's why I've selected this. But the most common one, heavily used, is Webpack. It's called Webpack. It's much more famous. It has the same idea. I have some source files. It could be JavaScript, CSS, and so on. And what it does, it gets transpiled. Transpiled means, in our case, in React, I am converting from JSX to plain JavaScript, and then bundling, putting these files together as one or two files. That's what the role of these bundlers, the role of this. So before I run my app, take a look at this. Before I run my app, what should I do? I have to call this parcel and give it the entry point of my app. In this case, what is the entry point? Index.html. So if I take this command here, go to my terminal. It's already running. Let me stop it. Paste this command here. So what this will be doing, in our case, you can run it in dev mode or you can run it in production mode. In development mode, what this utility will be doing, it will be transpiling all my components and bundling them in one JS file, and then running the app in a small server. So my app is now ready. I can just click the link here, and I can see my app, all the components of my app. Okay. Now, if I want to release this application, give it to the people out in the world to use, I can build it. Once I do this, here it is. Once I do this, it goes ahead and builds the app. It's like doing the traditional compiling. We don't call it compiling here, we call it transpiling. And it spells out all these under this dist. You see this dist folder here? Let me just, here. It creates this new folder, and here is my app there. So I can run this app from here. Yeah, the app is running from there. Not from the source. I never run the app from the source. It gets transpiled first. When I want to give this app to people or put it on the server, what do you think? Which ones will I be putting? The dist. Only the dist. That's it. This has everything needed for this app to run. Basically, here is my app. I can run it from here. No problem. I don't need anything else. It has everything needed. You can see here. Fully working. Yeah. Okay, so I hope it's clear. Now let me move on. One more thing I want to highlight here. In a component, you can use some CSS. There are two ways to use CSS in your component. You can use CSS the normal way we have seen. Normal way, we put a CSS in a CSS file, and then we import it. I can either import it here, you do import index.css, or I can just link it here if I wish. No, not this one, here. Or I can link it here. The normal way we link if you recall, the normal way we link the CSS. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it, if you wish, is that if there is some CSS that is specific to this component, if you wish, you can embed the CSS inside the component because it is very, very specific to this component. So in here, what I'm doing, I just went ahead, I just went ahead and created a variable called CSS. You can, of course, call it whatever you wish. And here I'm defining some CSS rules. The color is red, the font weight, and so on. And then all I do, if I want to apply this CSS to some to a particular element, all I do, I go ahead and say there is a property called style equal the variable name that defines the style. And basically, these styles will be applied to this component. This is a nice way to do it if I have some CSS that is specific to this component and it's not applicable to any other component. So when I have this component, it can be used in any place and it will have its own look and feel without being styled from outside. It has its own style embedded inside it. So this function, in this function, what I'm really doing, I'm creating a component. What's the name of it? Error box. And this is what I'm doing here. All I'm doing, I'm using this component and passing to it this message as a parameter. And what this component is doing, it will pick the message and display it in a red and a red border. So the output will be something like this, invalid loading. And the CSS to style this div is embedded inside the component. Is the idea clear? So you can use CSS outside your component, the normal way we have seen so far. Or, if you wish, some of the components you can embed their style inside them. Especially if that style is only applicable to that component. And you want this component to work anywhere without styling it from the user of the component. That's basically the idea. Moving on, in components, many times we find ourselves displaying a list. For example, let's say we have a list of friends and we want to display them. So the way we do that is using plain JavaScript. You know how to go through a list in JavaScript. So we go to friends, for example, in this case, and I do friends.map, which means visit every element of this friend list. And for every friend and its associated index, index here means the index of the elements in the list. It starts from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And what I'm doing here, all I'm doing, I am creating for each friend, I'm creating a list item. And what you can see here, I'm displaying the friend name inside the list item. Is one thing here required by React, every element on the page must have an ID. So must have a key. So what I'm doing here, I'm saying key equal I. And what is this I? This is the index. It must be unique. And why does React really needs this? Because sometimes we want to, let's say, delete this element, or we want to change this element. So we have to be able to go to it directly using the key. So that's why internally React needs every element on the page to have its own unique key. And that's how we do it. So at the end of the day, what this will do, this will generate something like this. It will generate an unordered list. Yes, please. It generates an unordered list with the list items. These are the list items. And every list item has an associated key. And this key is used internally by React if React needs to delete or change those list items in this case. You can see here in this function, what I'm doing in this function, creating a new component called userinfo. And it accepts some parameters. When these parameters come, they will land in this variable called props. And what I'm doing here, yes, creating a div and displaying props.first name, props.last name. Yeah. Now, I might have other things. It might be a big list of properties in this props. Could be age, could be GPA, could be address, and so on. I find myself putting this props dot so many times. Yeah. So instead of doing that, here is a more elegant way of doing it. This is called object destructuring. We have seen it let me please just explain this and then I'll take questions. So you have seen this object destructing already. Let me explain it one more time through an example. Here is an example here of what I mean by object destructuring. Okay, so what I do here, let student equal. So I'll create an object very quickly here. First name, last name, whatever, age, GPA, for example. So this is an object. I can go ahead and display this object. Now let's say I want to extract a couple of variables from this. I want to extract a couple of properties from this object and place them into variables. Of course, I can just go ahead and do something like let first name equal student that first name. This is one way of doing it, of course. But there is a more elegant way of doing it to extract properties from an object. It's called object destructuring. So what I will do, I will say here let first name, comma, last name. And I can even do here dot, 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 other props equal student. This is what object destructuring means. So what will happen here? The first name property of student will be assigned to the variable first name. The last name property of student will be assigned to the variable last name. And the remaining, which is what is remaining? Age and GPA will be assigned to other properties. What do we call this syntax? Object destructuring. I'm taking an object and chopping it back to simple variables. So if I do here first name, this is my first name, this is my last name, and what about the other props, what it will have? It will have an object with two properties, age and GPA. So this feature, which is object destructuring, is heavily used in React to make the code looks more elegant. So this is another, so instead of, see here, the problem here, the only, it's not very elegant every time I have to do props dot. This is a better way of doing it. I can take these props, do the structure, object destructuring into variables, and I can use these variables here. Yeah. Last stage, I can just do the destructuring in the parameter itself, like this. That's it. Not specific to React. This is JavaScript. This is JavaScript feature. Yes, try it here. Can we create here a function called, let's say, display? Yes. Display. And it takes as an input student. Yes. And what it does, it will do console.log student dot first name student dot last name. Yep, and then I'll say here display and I pass to it student. Yes. Now let's rewrite that function. I will say here display 2, and instead what I will do here, object destructuring, first name, last name, and then in here becomes much simpler. First name, last name. Here's my function. Yep, and then I call it here to exactly the same. Exactly the same. Yeah. This one looks little bit more scary, but much more elegant because I'm receiving the object, destructuring it, and then using these variables instead of dealing with the object. So there is this concept of props. So a component could have a props. So what are props? Parameters passed by the caller of the component. A component can also have a state. So these are very important concepts to understand and also to know the difference between them. So props are data coming from the outside. State, what is a state? It's an internal data that the component manages itself. And it is private. The outside world cannot access or modify the data.
But can see it if you want.
No, cannot see it. No. Component, that's the idea of component. Component is something encapsulated. It's a black box. How do we interact with components? How we can change, pass something to the component or influence the component through parameters. That's the only entry point. Of course, we will see shortly how a component can talk to the parent component. Yeah. So what I mean here, component has its own identity, its own state, and this state is not accessible from outside. Now, I explained to you the state last time, if you recall. We seen this example of counter. Remember the example of counter?
Yes.
And we saw that if a component has a state, which is nothing but a variable, set of variables inside the component, how should we create these variables?
We trace using React.
Using this React hook called useState. So I don't go just create a variable, a normal variable like before. I create this variable through this function called useState. And what this useState does, it creates two things for me. It returns two things for me. It returns the variable itself, and it returns a function to allow me to change that variable. Why is this needed? This is critical. We have discussed it at length last time.
In order to modify the UI.
To modify the UI. Remember this. This picture is very, very important. This picture is super important. So what we have here, a component has a state variables inside it. Now, some events might happen on the user interface of the components. So in React, when you are creating event handlers, these event handlers should not touch the UI. The UI should not be, you don't change the UI yourself as developer. As developer, you only change the state variables. And React is watching the state variables. If they change, any UI using the state variable will be re-rendered. That's the idea. Now, how does React know that some variable, some state variable has changed?
Using the state.
Because if you just use a normal variables, of course React will never know. Yes? So when you create state variables, you should create them using useState. What useState is returning? It's returning an array, and then I'm a destructor in it. And at the end of the day, it's returning a variable and a function to change that variable. Now, what is this 0 doing here? I'm initializing this count with 0. Yeah? This is very important. Never change the state directly by assigning a value to the state variable. You should not go to count equal count plus 1, for example. You should always change it through set state. And why so? So React will be aware of the change and go ahead and renders the UI, re-renders the UI. If you don't go through the set function, then React will not know. And I showed you this last time. We tried to change the counter directly. The counter does change, but the UI does not get re-rendered. That's the whole idea of React. Even the name, why we call it React, is because of this. It is watching state changes and re-rendering the page upon change of the state. Inside my UI, I have two buttons. If you remember, I have plus and minus. And this is nothing but plain JavaScript. That's another powerful aspect of React. React uses plain JavaScript. So what I'm doing here, listening to this on click, and when this on click happens, I will call this function called increment. And what this function increment does, it uses set count to increment the count. And when the on click happens for the minus, I call decrement to decrease the count and set the count. Yeah. And this way, you see this count here will be auto updated. In here, I don't have any code that accesses the DOM. Remember, all we do is we change the state, and React does the rest. There's two important concepts that React has. There is the concept of props, concept of state. So it must be very clear by now. Props are data passed to the child components from the parent components. And the props are read-only. So anything that you see here, in here, this is a prop coming from outside. If I change this in this variable, in this component, it will not be visible in the parent component. So props are read-only. Don't expect that this is kind of, remember in programming we have pass by reference. And if you change it, it will change in the parent. No. In here, props are read-only. Props are read-only. So that's the difference. While state, what is the concept of a state? The state is an internal data managed by the components. It cannot be accessed or modified except by the component. And which means that the states are private variables modified inside the components only, and we create them using useState. React automatically renders the UI whenever state or props are updated. Whenever the props or the state is changed, React will automatically re-render the component. This slide is very, very critical because it summarizes the whole idea of what React really is. Okay, so what is really left in terms of concepts? We have seen how the parent communicates with the child by passing props. In next class, with the parent, how the child component can talk to the parent component. And the other skill you need, how to do routing. These are the two skills needed. And then we'll go through a lot of examples to further solidify your understanding.